I had to get married. That's the boldest statement ever, isn't it? I suppose it takes two to tango, so I had to say that Maddie and I had to get married because otherwise it would have been a bit lonely standing there alone. But even that statement is only a half-truth, because if we didn't want to anyway, it just wouldn't have happened. James, Maddie, my steady girlfriend for the past 12 months or so, spoke up one fine Friday evening. I have some news for you. Good news or bad news? I smiled back, looking at my 5-foot-tall, blonde, slender, and rather gorgeous other half. I'm not sure, James. Maddie grinned a little nervously. It could go either way, depends on you. The rest of the conversation need not be recounted to show where it led. Suffice it to say that within moments we were in each other's arms, professing our love to each other and trying to decide when I would turn my newly pregnant girlfriend into my newly pregnant wife. Anytime that's convenient for your family, Maddie offered. I have no family left after Aunt Beth died, and there's no one in Lister I'm particularly friendly with. It was the truth. Maybe sad, but the truth. Poor Maddie had lost both her parents as a child in a motorcycle accident, and after several years in foster care was eventually taken in by Auntie Beth, an old friend of Maddie's late mother who lived near Leeds. Poor Aunt Beth passed away just a few weeks before I had a chance to meet her. I was in Canada on business when she died, and by the time I got back, Maddie had already arrived in Leeds for the funeral, and everything was done and buried. Literally. What about Beth's son, Maddie? I asked somewhat reluctantly, as on previous occasions when it came to him she had interrupted the conversation. You were once close to Tom, weren't you? Wouldn't you like him to be present this day? Tom's in jail, James, Maddie snapped, irritation evident in her voice. I've told you before, I don't want to talk about him. Oops. I should have not mentioned Tom. I knew he was serving a sentence at Her Majesty's will, but I didn't know what for or where. Touchy subject? I better change the subject quickly. My parents are both retired, so I think any date would suit them. The sooner the better. James, my future wife, smiled, stroking her flat tummy, and her anger was forgotten. Let's call them right now. And so we did. Just 4 weeks later, we were joined in marriage at the registry office in Bedford, where we lived in the presence of a small group of my relatives and our mutual friends. We traveled to West Indies, where we had a wonderful honeymoon. But it was still a few weeks after we returned when Maddie's tummy began to show signs of our first child, Beth. That's what we named the little bundle of joy that eventually came screaming into the world with a full set of fingers and toes and a pair of lungs that promised a few sleepless nights. My mom's name was too long and out of fashion, so our daughter was named after the woman Maddie considered her mother. I thought it was fitting, and Maddie loved me for it. Married life was wonderful, and while I don't claim we never had disagreements, Maddie and I settled well together with our lovely little daughter. As Beth began to mature, she did indeed go blonde, and even a hint of red appeared in her hair in the right light. Unlike me with my swarthy complexion and completely black hair, Maddie was a dirty blonde, so Beth took the example of her half of the family. However, little Beth had more of my temperament. She rarely got upset or even cried, unlike Maddie, who was always prone to being overly emotional. A good mix, you could say the best of both sides, though of course I was never brave enough to suggest such a thing to my dear wife. We had been married for almost 4 years, and Beth was already 3 years old when suddenly things went wrong in the Dawson household. Beth was her usual happy self, and I was more than content with my life, but Maddie was clearly not happy. She quit her job just before Beth was born, and since I was making good money, never came back. By then we lived in a nice little village north of Bedford, and 2 or 3 times a week Maddie would take Beth to Bedford to do some shopping, take her to the clinic, or just meet up with friends she used to work with. Yes, and when I was around we would sometimes meet for lunch, which was very nice. But lately she was coming home in a very pensive mood after trips into town, and something was clearly bothering her. Maddie had been prone to periods of moodiness in the first few weeks we'd been dating after a mutual friend introduced us. It was obviously due to her concern that we'd gotten into a serious relationship pretty quickly, but she'd put it out of her mind a long time ago. I asked what the problem was, of course, but all I got was a good old-fashioned shake of the head. I considered the possibility that she was having an affair with some guy, but she always had Beth with her, so it didn't seem even a remote possibility. As it turned out, I was right in that assumption, but it might have been better if that was the case. "What's the matter, Maddie?" I demanded finally, more insistently, when she had completely collapsed. She looked up at me and just stared sadly for a while before she spoke. "I think I owe you an explanation, James. You're going to find out soon enough anyway, so I might as well get it over with." "Find out what?" I asked, and her words filled me with dread. Was she sick? Was there something wrong with our beautiful daughter? "Put Beth to bed, dear," she suggested with a sigh. "Then come downstairs and we'll talk." "Okay." I tucked baby Beth in and carried her upstairs, glad that she was so sleepy and didn't insist that I stay up to read her a story. I wanted to go back downstairs and find out what the problem was. If I had known at that moment, I would have stayed with Beth longer. Heck, if I had known what was going to happen, I might never have left her bedroom. "Come and sit here, James," Maddie told me, pointing to a chair on the opposite side of the table where she was sitting, not next to her, which was not a reassuring sign. "James, dear," she began, taking a deep breath before continuing. "You've asked about Tom a few times, and I've never told you anything, have I?" "No," I agreed. "You always blow me off." "Well, it's time to tell you about Tom," Maddie continued, and no more than a whisper. "Tom is a couple years older than me, and when I was younger he was like a big brother to me after I went to live with him and his mother." "Sounds pretty normal," I added to cheer her up. "Yeah, but things changed when we got older, James." Maddie continued avoiding my gaze. We weren't really related, and we became, well, as boyfriend and girlfriend. I just nodded, wondering where this conversation was going and suspecting I wasn't going to like it. Then as we moved into adolescence, we became something more, much more. "And what did his mother make of that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even and not thinking too hard about what much more meant. She was all for it. Tom was a bit of a wild boy, just like his father was before he died on his motorcycle. "I never told you, but the reason my parents and Tom were so friendly was because they were all bikers, Hell's Angels and all." "Hell's Angels," exclaimed I, completely caught off guard. "Yeah," Maddie replied, "all four of them. But your parents died in a bicycle accident too, didn't they?" "Yes, they died," Maddie admitted sadly. "They were riding in a big group to Brighton for a week when they took a corner too fast and wrote themselves off." "And Tom's dad?" I asked cautiously, already knowing the details of her parents' deaths, but wondering if there was more to it. "It happened just 4 months later when he was driving to work. He was hit by a truck, and Aunt Beth lost her husband and 2 best friends in such a short period of time that she never got on a bike again. She grew to hate those things. Well, that's understandable," I sympathized, having never liked those things myself. In my mind, anything that traveled the roads on 2 wheels was either a bicycle if it didn't have an engine, or the front or back half of an automobile if it did. "Then Aunt Beth took me in and raised me as her own daughter," Maddie continued. "But she was in favor of Tom and you being together." "Yes, she was in favor of it," continued Maddie, and her whole demeanor indicated that she was half back in those days. "Like I said, Tom was a real wild man, desperately fond of motorcycles and raced them without any fear, just like his father. Beth hated the thought of what might happen to him, and I guess she figured I could be a good influence on him." "And did you?" "I guess not," Maddie sighed. "In fact, it was the other way around, and I ended up being as wild as Tom." We were part of a motorcycle gang, and we did all kinds of stuff we shouldn't have been doing. Quite a lot of stuff that legally we shouldn't have been doing. "You mean speeding?" I asked. "Yes, of course, but a lot of other things too. We all had a great reputation with the local police." "Is that how Tom got locked up?" I speculated aloud, still trying to realize that my dear, sweet young wife had once been a biker. At least that might explain the tattoo on her ass, which she never wanted to explain. Maddie didn't answer right away, just sat there looking like she was gathering her strength to say something to me. "Sort of," she finally muttered, and I waited for her to continue. "We were out with the bike club one night, and on our way back from Manchester, when we stopped to meet up with another group we knew. Tom was riding his new Honda with me on the back, and I was desperately begging him to let me try it. I didn't actually have a license, although I had ridden a less powerful Suzuki he had before, but I had never tried anything as heavy and powerful as his new bike, so he didn't want to. This upset me, and like a fool I started flirting with another biker named Mike, who rode with another gang. I knew he always liked me, and I tried on him a few times. Since I'm being honest, I'll admit that he and I had a bit of history when Tom wasn't around. Of course, we never went too far with him, but there were a few times we went beyond just kissing. "I can't believe what I'm hearing, Maddie," I gasped. It seemed almost impossible to me that the mother of my child could behave in such a way. "It was all a few years ago, James," she replied with a remorseful look. "I'm a few years older now and much wiser than I was then, dear. Are you sure you want me to go on?" "Yes, go on, Maddie," I told her. "This was all before I knew you. I admit I'm surprised by all this, but it doesn't affect my feelings for you in any way." My wife let out another heavy sigh and smiled sadly at me, but otherwise remained silent, and I had to gesture again to ask her to continue the story. Tom, God bless him, became very jealous of the way I was acting, and the two gangs began to feud a bit with each other. Trouble was brewing, but I, silly little cow, just kept enjoying the turmoil I was creating. Eventually, Tom came over and tried to pull me away from Mike, but I wouldn't budge. I told Mike that Tom was being rude to me and wouldn't let me ride his Honda and let me try his Kawasaki. There was no chance since Mike's bike was even more powerful than the Honda, but he played along with me. "Did he let you ride it?" "No," I said there was no chance, but he wanted me to get on the back seat with him and take off. 2 or 3 of their friends were kind of cheering them both on, but at the same time trying to calm them down. But then Mike went even further and said that if I went topless and rode on his back with him, he'd let me take the back afterward. "Topless?" I exclaimed incredulously. "What made that idiot think you do that?" "Because I've done it before, James, several times." She shook me awake. "Only on your back with Tom, of course. I'm having a hard time accepting all this, Maddie," I told her, shaking my head as my stomach did some results. "It's not like the girl I met and married. I've told you before, James, I'm older and wiser now, but at the time it was, well, fun." I finished for her, to which she nodded and continued, trying to keep a smile on her face. "Jesus, Maddie," I muttered. "You were a real bitch back then, weren't you?" "I guess I was," she replied calmly. "But you have to realize that in a crowd like that, guys are kings, and girls are treated almost like property, in public, if not in private. When a girl got a chance to lord it over one of the guys, it was a real thrill. I suppose that's one reason why there were so many fights over women." "So he let you try the Honda?" I asked. "However, that soon changed." "Yes," she continued. "I put on my jacket, kissed Mike on the cheek to annoy Tom, and then went with him to his Honda. He was really mad at me, but he kept his word, and in a few minutes I was driving slowly across the parking lot with Tom in the back seat. I loved it, and by then I think even Tom was starting to be okay with it since I was doing so well. And then it all went to shit." "What happened?" asked I impatiently. Apparently I pissed Mike off, and he, coming over on his Kawasaki, started edging me. Tom started getting angry and told me to stop, but of course I knew better and started going faster. Then Mike pulled out of the parking lot and roared down the road, and even though Tom was yelling at me, I raced after him. At that moment, I couldn't help but notice that tears appeared in Maddie's eyes, and it looked like she was about to burst into tears. I moved over and hugged her, urging her to take her time, but she shook her head and continued, starting to sob as she finished her story. Mike drove faster and faster, and like an idiot I chased after him. It was exhilarating, and I ignored Tom's shouts for me to stop and kept going. At this point, Maddie burst into tears, sobbing so pitifully that I couldn't understand what she was telling me, and it was several more minutes before she could finish her story. By then, I had already guessed it wasn't going to end happily, and I wasn't wrong. Mike had fallen behind and was riding beside us, encouraging me to go faster and faster, and Tom was going crazy, pounding me on the back to slow down. But I wasn't slowing down. I tried to pass Mike, but I couldn't do it. I lost control. What happened, Maddie? I asked softly, hugging her as she cried aloud, remembering the obviously horrible experience. The Honda slid out from under me and slammed into Mike's car. I didn't realize what had happened, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in the hospital sometime later in some sort of coma. I had a pretty bad bump on my head, but fortunately for Tom, he was more or less unharmed. And this Mike, I demanded. What happened to him, Maddie? Dead. Dead? Yes, dead. Shit. That's right. But then what happened, honey? I don't understand. You were riding the motorcycle and Tom was just a passenger. How did he end up in jail? He took all the blame, James, she sobbed. By the time I came to my senses and was able to realize what was going on around me, it was too late. Tom told the police that he was the one in the front seat and blamed it on him. But it wasn't him, Maddie, I protested. It was you. I know. But why would he do that, honey? I searched for an explanation. Why would he take the blame? Because he loved me, she answered simply. I was his woman and he wanted to protect me. Shit. Exactly. We were fed up by then and neither of us wanted to talk about it any further. So we settled down on the couch and were silent for what seemed like an awfully long time. Eventually I realized that there was more to the story, and I had to find out everything. What else do you want to tell me, Maddie? I asked at last. There must be more to Tom's actions than you've told me so far. Of course you're right, Maddie admitted. At the time, believe it or not, Tom had a clean history with the police. He'd been pulled over a few times, given speeding tickets and stuff, but nothing more than that. Mike didn't look too bad after the accident, so Tom didn't think anything serious would come of it and told the police he was in the driver's seat. Unlike Tom, I had a couple of criminal records and he was afraid I'd be prosecuted, so deciding it wasn't that serious took the blame. You had 2 criminal records? I muttered, wondering what other revelations awaited me. Jesus, Maddie, were you a criminal? Not exactly, James. Maddie smiled guiltily. I've already told you about the cases I've been up to. They were both for indecent exposure. What? Riding naked on a bike around the campground is one thing, but the cops didn't like that we were doing it downtown. Twice? I inquired. More than twice, Maddie whispered. I got caught 3 times, but they let me go the first time. I didn't know if I could take that much more, but she went on to explain how Mike had suddenly gotten worse and was suddenly out of the game, and Tom had stuck to his story to protect Maddie. When the case went to trial, his case was scuttled, and he ended up getting an unexpectedly large sentence. Sounds like you owe a lot to that Tom, Maddie. I sighed when she stopped. When does he due out? That's the problem, James. He's got a few more years ahead of him, but I just found out that they're going to give him remission for good behavior, and he'll be out very soon. When? Thursday, she surprised me. The day after tomorrow. That's why I've been upset the last couple weeks. Jesus, what a mess. I rested my head on my hands and thought for a while. Maddie really did owe a lot to this guy, and as much as I doubted it, I knew I couldn't just ask her to dump him after what he'd done for her. I didn't like it one bit, but she was my wife. I loved her, and I knew what had to be done. Poor bastard. While he was in jail for something he didn't even do, his mother died and his girlfriend married someone else. I guess he's got nowhere to go when he gets out, doesn't he? I asked silently, praying that my assumption wouldn't turn out to be correct. Not really. She disappointed me. His mom's house is only rented, and he's lost touch with his old friends in Leeds. Wait a minute. I've missed something. How do you know that, Maddie? I asked her. How do you know so much about him if he's in prison somewhere up north? He's not up north, James. Maddie replied so quietly I barely heard her. He was, but he got into fights there and was transferred. To where? I asked, already knowing what the answer would be before the words even left my mouth. To Bedford, she muttered. Right here, to Bedford prison. What a bloody coincidence, I remarked sarcastically. I'm sorry, James, darling. I know I should have told you a long time ago, but I kept avoiding it. It was getting harder and harder for me to tell you. I felt trapped and didn't know how to get out of it. So you went to Bedford often to visit him? Not all the time, but she shrugged but didn't finish. The tears were still slowly rolling down her cheek, and we stood looking at each other, wondering what to say next. "I moved here to be near him, James. I thought it would work out, but I didn't count on meeting anyone else, honey. I didn't expect to meet you. I just didn't allow myself to think that I would fall in love with another man. What are we going to do now, Maddie? I don't know, James. Like I said, I knew what I had to do. I didn't even know the guy, but Maddie owed him a great debt of gratitude, and she was my wife. Time to show some generosity. Look, Maddie," I began. "I don't like the idea, but I suppose he could come and stay here for a few days. Just long enough for him to find a place of his own. Perhaps we could help him with a few shillings to get him started." "I can't, James." "Why not?" I asked, feeling somewhat relieved that she didn't think it was a good idea. "I don't think it would suit him, James." "Why the hell not?" I growled, thinking my suggestion was pretty damn understandable under the circumstances. "He doesn't know about you, James. He doesn't know. Tom doesn't know I'm married, James. I'm sorry, darling, but I never had the courage to tell him that, and he still thinks I'm waiting for him to leave. I've ruined everything, have a night. Oh, shit. Exactly. Next chapter." The rest of the evening passed like a nightmare. We skirted around each other, trying to figure out in our own brains what to do. When we eventually spoke again, I tried to let her know that next time she would have to tell Tom the truth, because the longer she put it off, the harder it would be. I was very angry with her for being so stupid, especially since she was usually such an organized and honest person. But Maddie was my wife. I loved her to bits, and of course I needed to think about our daughter, Beth. Yeah, Beth. Here's the thing. I realized that Maddie still had strong feelings for Tom, even though I didn't press her on the issue. But Maddie and I had Beth, so I didn't worry about what she'd been in love with for a long time. I really wanted to insist that she tell this Tom guy to back off, but in the back of my mind I knew that would be a mistake. Maddie had to deal with this on her own, and it was my job to help her do that. The next day, the day before he was released, Beth went to visit Tom and tell him the truth. It wasn't easy, but it had to be done, and I took the day off to be there when she got home, knowing she would need my support. I waited for her at home, insides trying to turn inside out, wondering what state she'd come back in. "Hi, Maddie." I greeted her at the door as she walked down the path to the garden. "How did it go? How did Tom take it?" "Didn't take it," she replied, somewhat puzzled as she slipped past me. "What do you mean he didn't take it?" "I didn't tell him, James," Maddie replied without looking at me. "He was so excited, like it was the best day of his life. I just couldn't do it, James. I just couldn't break his heart when he was so happy. For God's sake, Maddie," I began angrily. "Do you think he'll feel better tomorrow? You think he'll be less upset?" "Grow up, you stupid woman. I'm not going to tell him that tomorrow, Tom," Maddie blurted out. "I've made my decision, James, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to give him a few days of happiness before I destroy him. It's the least I owe him, James, whatever it costs me." I stood with my mouth open as the meaning of what my wife had said reached me. "A few days of happiness?" Anxiously I asked. "Yes, James," she replied, finally lifting her head with a determined expression on her face. "I've booked a hotel room in town for tomorrow night, and I intend to repay Tom for what he's done for me." "No way, Maddie," I shouted at her. "If you think I'm going to stand by while another man entertains my wife, you have another thing to think about. Jesus, woman, I know you owe him, but this is ridiculous." "You can't stop me, James," she screamed back. "It's my decision, my body, and I'm going to do what I know how to do. I owe him so much, James. Please try to understand. I do understand. You're going to let another man entertain you. It's not going to happen, Maddie. It's just not going to happen. I've already made up my mind, James. No way in hell, Maddie. I'll do it, James, darling. Please, why can't you understand? Then I might not be here when you get home, Maddie." I threatened. "If you let him entertain you even once, our marriage will go down the drain. I was hoping you'd be more understanding, James." She started to plead with me. "You know the situation I'm in, and I have to do this. Please. James, try to understand." "There's nothing to understand," I exclaimed angrily. "Then there's nothing to talk about," she shouted back. Damn you, James! Why can't you understand? I'm not taking anything away from you, damn you to hell! You do that and we're finished. Screw you, you miserable bastard. She finished and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her and leaving me standing there bewildered. And that was it. I tried to talk to her later that night, but when it became clear that there was no way I was giving in, she just shut my mouth. I wanted to strangle that stupid cow, and I couldn't believe she couldn't see what she was doing to our relationship. What about Beth? Oh God, what about poor Beth, whose life is about to be torn apart? I got up pretty early, slept in the spare bedroom, got Beth up and dressed, and made her breakfast. I wasn't going to stick around and watch Maddie go off to commit an act of adultery, and I planned to take Maddie with me for the day so we wouldn't be there. Another day off work, but what the hell? See you tomorrow, James, Maddie muttered, kissing and fussing around Beth as I was about to leave. Maybe not, I grudgingly muttered, pushing her away when she tried to kiss me too. Please don't be like this, James, she sobbed. It's going to be okay, honey, I promise you. It's not going to be okay, Maddie. Please change your mind. What happened to Mommy? Intervened Beth as her mother began to cry. She's just being silly, honey, I replied, scooped her up in my arms, and without another word ran out the door. All in all, the day spent with Beth wasn't too bad. It started with a trip to the zoo in Whipsnade, and ended quite predictably at McDonald's. I decided that I really should spend more time walking with my daughter, although the prospect of doing it on my own in the future didn't really appeal to me. I really tried to understand how Maddie felt about this problem, and could understand how hard it was for her. However, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't agree with her actions. I then tried to put myself in Tom's shoes and found myself struggling here as well. The poor guy went to jail for loving a woman, and what did the cow do to him? Damn it. What a nuisance. When is Mommy coming home, Daddy? Asked my little daughter when we got home. She's gone out for the night, honey, I told her, trying to sound lighthearted. She'll be back soon. Who did she leave with, Daddy? Just with a friend, I replied, not wanting to spread the word. Is it Tom? She then shocked me, never having considered the possibility that my daughter might know something about him. How do you know about Tom? I asked nervously. Mom and I visit him, Dad, when we go to Bedford. It's not very nice there, but Mom says he can't live with us because the people there say he should stay where he is. I looked at my little daughter in bewilderment. What a bitch my loving wife had turned out to be behind my back. Not only had she deceived Tom and me, she'd taken our daughter to see that bastard in that damn prison. I began to wonder if I even knew my wife. Mommy said Tom will be out soon, Daddy. Beth continued. What does that mean? It means he won't have to live in that disgusting place anymore, honey. I told her without hesitation. Oh, good, she replied. He's really nice, Tom. Will he be able to come and live with us then? I don't think so, Beth, I replied sadly. I just don't think it's possible. That night was awful, and I just didn't want to put my daughter to bed. It was one of those rare occasions when she had to tell me she was tired and wanted to go to bed. Eventually, she fell asleep in my arms, and I held her in my arms for a while longer before I finally gave up and carried her into the bedroom, taking no pleasure in the thought of having to spend the rest of the evening alone. The phone calls certainly didn't help. Hi, honey, Maddie greeted me as I reluctantly picked up the phone. What do you want? Rudely, I replied. Please don't be like this, James, she begged. I'm just calling to make sure you're both okay. Beth is fine, I told her. She's already in bed. And you, James? Maddie fiddled. Are you okay? Have you done this before? I demanded angrily, ignoring her question. Please, James. Has he entertained you yet? I repeated even louder, interrupting her. James, answer the damn question, okay? I shouted at her. Yes, muttered Maddie in response. It's happened twice already, and it'll happen again when he comes back. Hope you enjoyed the hell out of it, you cheating bitch. I did, she shouted into my phone. Her temper is much as mine. What's more, he knows how to pleasure a woman. There was silence after that statement as I recoiled from her words, and she apparently realized exactly what she had said to me. James, honey, she cried out desperately after a few moments. I didn't mean to say that, honey. I swear I didn't. I don't know how she finished that sentence. My ego went to hell and back, and my heart shattered into little pieces. I slowly and purposefully put the phone back on the stand and stood looking at it with tears in my eyes. Sure enough, a few seconds later it started ringing again, but I grabbed the cable and unplugged it. When my cell phone started beeping a minute or so later, I fumbled for the off button, failed, and threw it against the wall with all my might. It stopped beeping, shattering to pieces, and I stood in silence, large tears running down my cheek by then. I stood there and sobbed while my wife waited for her lover to come back and service her. I sobbed as I watched the devastating loneliness engulf me, hating the whole world and almost everything in it. I stood there for probably an hour or more, half wondering and half hoping that Maddie would show up and set things right. But that was impossible, and of course she didn't come back. It wasn't until I thought of my baby Beth that I perked up, realizing that I would have to be brave for her sake. She was all I had, and that gave me the strength to carry on. I brewed myself a cup of tea, the solution to all my woes, and sat thinking about how my life would change. Would I be able to get Maddie back? God, what a question. All my senses were telling me no, but my heart was speaking differently, almost in a different language that I could barely understand. The only thing I was sure of was that for Beth's sake, I had to be strong. I would fight to the last to keep her with me, no matter how hard Maddie tried. I felt like I was even willing to take Maddie back for Beth's sake. But who was I kidding? I wanted Maddie back for my own sake, no matter what she did. But I knew it would never be the same. It wouldn't work, and it wouldn't happen. And I whimpered again, thinking about what was about to happen to the poor, sweet little girl who was sleeping soundly upstairs, oblivious to the turmoil around her. Damn you, Maddie. Why would you do that to the people who love you? Next chapter. The next morning I woke up to something stroking my face. Wake up, Daddy, I heard through my foggy brain. Why didn't you go to bed last night? Good morning, sweetheart. I greeted her sleepily. I just fell asleep on the couch and forgot to go to bed. Silly Daddy. Beth giggled. Mom will think you're stupid when I tell her. I think Mom already thinks I'm stupid, I replied, sighing deeply as the situation weighed heavily on my overburdened shoulders again. Dad took time off work to watch you again. Where do you want to go? Can we go to the zoo, please, Daddy? My baby girl exclaimed happily, clapping her hands together. But we went there yesterday, sweet bunch, I pointed out to her. But I want to go again, Daddy. She giggled back. I want to see the big elephants and the funny monkeys and one of those big ones with the long, funny necks called Daddy. Giraffes, honey, I answered her. But you saw them all yesterday. How about we go to Old Warden and look at the old airplanes? Are there lions and tigers and things there? No, Beth, there aren't, I explained to her, quite envisioning a trip to an old airplane museum I hadn't been to in years, if only for the distraction. But they have lots of other interesting things. Do they have a McDonald's there, Dad? I explained that they probably didn't, but we could find one on the way home, and that was the end of it. Yes, a half hour later we were on our way back to the zoo. It was a nice day, and for a few hours I was able to more or less forget my troubles and enjoy my daughter. Perhaps she will become a veterinarian when she grows up. All was well until we walked out of McDonald's full of triple burgers and frothy milkshakes, and the clouds started to descend again. How the hell could I have screwed this up? How could I have ruined our marriage and ruined little Beth's life? Maybe Maddie and I could get over her transgression, and in a few years all the problems with Tom would be a distant memory. Maybe. By the time we got home, little Beth was ready for bed, so we settled back on the couch, and for the second night in a row I carried her sleeping form upstairs. So far so good. But then I had to wait on my own to see what time Maddie would be back. We hadn't discussed the matter, so I had no idea when she was coming home. Heck, all we'd done was yell at each other since she'd announced her plans. I promised myself that when she came back, I would keep my cool and try to talk reasonably. Deep down, I understood why she felt she had to do what she did, but she had to understand my point of view. I highly doubted we could overcome what I only saw as her cheating on me, but for Beth's sake, I would do my best. But only if she did too. I waited until 9 o'clock, somehow confident that that was the time she'd be back. Then I waited until 10 and started to get angry again. At 20 minutes past 10, the newly connected phone rang. "Hello, James Dawson here," I answered cautiously. "Are you in a better mood than you were last night, James?" demanded the voice on the other end. "Not much, Maddie," I replied. "When are you coming home?" "Depends on you, James," she said, instantly reminding me of that fateful day when she first told me she was pregnant with Beth. "If I come back in the morning, you're going to talk sense to me instead of yelling at me. Tomorrow morning?" I answered her. "You have to come back tonight." "There's been a change of plan, James," she announced. "Now are you going to talk sense or not?" I counted to 5 to contain my fervor before answering. "Have you told him yet?" I asked, ignoring her question. "Does he know about us being married?" "Yes, James, he does." "So he took it pretty well," Maddie informed me, as if discussing with someone the news that he'd been kicked off the village soccer team. "He took it a lot better than you did." "Yeah," I replied, fighting the urge not to yell at her. "And where exactly were you two when he took the news so well?" No answer. "And what exactly were you two doing when you broke the news to him, Maddie?" I continued. "Or were you already done?" Still no answer. "I'll see you when you get home, Maddie," I announced into the silent phone. "That's when we'll decide if it's still your house or not." There was a click this time. Maddie hung up on me. In the morning, I picked Beth up, made her favorite breakfast, and drove her to the dance class she attended every Saturday morning. There I arranged with one of the other moms to pick her up and keep her for a while if I didn't get back in time. Maddie usually picks her up, but she's been gone for a couple nights, I explained, wondering how long it would be before the truth came out. "It's okay," the other mom told me. "Beth can stay with us all day if you want to hang out with Maddie for a while." "Thanks," I said. I think I managed to smile, but I'm not sure. That wasn't true, of course, but even Tim didn't know that. "He killed someone in an accident, James," my friend informed me. "He's paid his price to society and has the same rights as everyone else. How does he look? Doesn't he look a little dubious or something? Is there anything we can use against him? I have no idea. I had to admit, I've never met him and I've never seen him. Maybe you should talk to James. All this time I'd been killing Beth with kindness and attention, coming up with various excuses as to why her favorite mommy hadn't come to see her. "When is Mommy coming home, Daddy?" she asked sleepily. "Soon, honey," I told her, unable to tell her the truth just yet. "I miss Mommy." "Me too, honey," I replied with tears in my eyes, hugging her desperately. And I missed her. Oh God, how I missed this woman. I was about to meet this Tom much more easily, and probably sooner than I had anticipated, when my buddy called me and asked me to come to a meeting with the other parties, as he put it, and their attorney. I put on a manly look as I walked to the meeting, wondering what that bastard Tom really looked like. Come on, biker, Hell's Angel and all. I expected Tom to be some fat, long-haired scumbag. The tall, clean-shaven, blonde-haired, somewhat slender and athletically built man who appeared before me took me by surprise. "Hi, James." He greeted me with a nervous smile on his face, extending his hand for a handshake. "I'm sorry we have to meet like this. I'm actually sorry about all of this. Oh, shit. I really wanted to hate this guy, but I accepted his hand and shook it. At least I wasn't smiling too much. And maybe this wouldn't be as hard as I expected. How wrong I'd been. Mr. Dawson, their lawyer, a corpulent, grinning bastard, opened the proceedings. "It's quite obvious that your wife is not going to take you back, so there's no point in you trying to do that." Tim, my lawyer, held out his hand to keep me from hitting him, and accepted the challenge. "I don't think my client is interested in that possibility either," he objected. "As far as we understand it, this is simply a matter of deciding your client's access to the daughter from this marriage. Obviously, my client will be the primary custodian and she will live with him, but he is willing to grant reasonable access to his soon-to-be ex-wife. It's not that simple," the fat man replied with a smile that would do honor to a crocodile. "My client, that is to say my clients, have first right to the child." "Bullshit!" I exclaimed, but Tim ordered me to calm down again. The fact that my client, Mrs. Dawson, is the mother of the child is not in dispute. The fat man continued. Are we in agreement on that? Tim acknowledged the fact, throwing me a cheerful look, just as I was puzzled by the other guy's line of thinking. Then we also have to acknowledge who the father is, the bastard continued. And this time, Tim had to physically restrain me from confronting the asshole. My clients claim that Mr. Dawson is not the father of the child, and the father is her ex-boyfriend, Mr. Thomas Wellings. Tom? Tom is Beth's father? What the hell kind of nonsense is that? I was so shocked that I just sat there with my mouth open. We have documentary evidence, medical evidence, that Mr. Wellings is 99% certain that he is the child's father by birth. We also have irrefutable evidence that your client, Mr. Dawson, cannot be the father. What the hell are you talking about? I shouted at the fat bastard. Beth is my daughter. I was there when she was born and I bought her back. Apparently not, Mr. Dawson. The fat man interrupted me. You may have bought her back as your daughter, but you are not her real father. It is my client, Mr. Wellings. But that's impossible, I protested. He was in prison when Maddie became pregnant. I was there when she was born, for heaven's sake. It's just not possible. My clients explained that to Mr. Dawson. He continued monotonously. Apparently you were in Canada when Mr. Wellings' mother died, and he was granted compassionately from prison to attend her funeral. My client, Mrs. Dawson, then Miss Jones, also attended the funeral, and well, let's just say they had the opportunity to get reacquainted. I felt the room begin to spin as I took in what he was telling me. I couldn't believe it, but deep down I knew it was possible. I was swarthy and generally stocky. Beth grew tall, slender, and blonde, just like her father. Oh shit. As the room swirled around me, Maddie burst into tears and ran out of the room. Tom got up to follow her, but hesitated. I'm sorry, James, he said to me. I swear to you, Maddie had no idea you weren't Beth's father until she started growing up and looked like me. That excuses her? I shouted at him. Does that make it acceptable to have fun with you when she was actually engaged to me? No, he agreed quietly, shaking his head. Maddie has no excuse for her behavior, but I love her, always have, and... Oh shit, James, I'm so sorry. With those words, he turned on his heels and followed Maddie out of the office. Well, Mr. Dawson, the fat lawyer spoke again. Can we make a deal? I'm having a busy day, so if we could come to some acceptable terms, perhaps? Before I could react, Tim jumped to his feet and yelled at the other attorney. Shut up, you miserable bastard! One more word and I swear I'll ram your nose through the other side of your face myself. Not very professional, the fat man remarked snidely, but stood up, gathered his papers and hurried out of the office. You'll be hearing more about me. Sorry, James, sighed my buddy, my personal legal eagle, as he walked away. I didn't expect that. No, neither did I. My story doesn't end there. But it might be worth mentioning that the sight of Maddie's back as she ran out of the office was the last time I looked at her. Had I known that then, perhaps my actions over the next period of time might have been different. But on reflection, perhaps not. Tim phoned his secretary and told her to cancel all business for the rest of the day. And despite her protests, he took me under his arm and practically dragged me in a daze to the nearest pub. There, the two of us drank the first 3 pints in the time it took to order them, and within the next hour, somewhat mysteriously, 5 or 6 of my best buddies showed up to help me drink myself into unconsciousness. I don't remember the end of the evening or leaving, nor can I remember the next day, as the first coherent thought came to me the next morning. I woke up in a strange bed with a strange woman. I never realized what the arrangement was, but if anyone was paying her, it certainly wasn't me. Anyway, the girl disappeared and I never saw her again. I'm not going to pretend that a black cloud has descended on me, and I've withdrawn from the world. I'm the kind of person who thinks his glass is half full, not half empty. And with that positive attitude, I set out to organize my life. Okay, there was a black cloud, of course, but I tried my best. I met everyone who came my way, pretty or not, but most often I came across women with children, single mothers or divorced. As you can imagine, this made me quite popular, and I got my just rewards quite often. but the only one of them I developed feelings for dumped me when she accused me of only needing me for my daughter. That's right. I was trying, perhaps overzealously, to replace my daughter Beth. I was trying to find a partner to replace Beth. Crazy? Yes, I know, but that's what it was. Eventually, I realized my problem and tried to work it out. It cut down on the number of women I dated, but there was nothing wrong with that. What about Beth herself? You might reasonably ask. Yes. I insisted on having access to her, even though there was no blood connection between us. But it was a bloody disaster. Maddie and Tom moved back to Leeds, and I had to come down one day for a week to visit her. Neither Maddie nor Tom minded, to be honest, and indeed did everything they could to make the trip easier for me. It was Tom I talked to every time I called, and it was Tom who met me when I came to pick up Beth. And Maddie, perhaps wisely, made sure I couldn't meet her. But it didn't go very well. Poor Beth was just confused and spent all day trying to talk me into coming and living with them, not realizing at her tender age how unlikely it was that it would ever happen. She went on and on about it, unable to accept that Daddy didn't love Mommy anymore, constantly telling me how good Papa Tom was and how happy I would be. When I took her back, she started crying when she realized I was going to keep her and clung to me, screaming out words and throwing tantrums. Eventually, Tom had to pull her off me and hold her in his arms as I ran out of the house, my tears matching poor Beth's. It was awful and broke my heart again, perhaps even more than before. It was the worst decision I'd ever made in my life, but I vowed from that moment on that I would not visit her again. I couldn't put little Beth through that kind of suffering again, and I didn't think I could take it. When I told Tom about my decision, he tried to talk me out of it, saying that they would do everything they could to make it less traumatic next time. But deep down we both knew it had to be for the best. In the end, we agreed that I would give her 6 months to give Beth time to settle into her new life, and then we would see. We agreed, but we both knew what that really meant, which was that for her sake I would no longer be involved in her life. Maybe when she grows up, I promised myself, maybe when she graduated high school or something. I promised myself all sorts of things, but in reality I was once again completely on my own, and the memories of my wife and daughter were just memories. I will be forever grateful that I was not suicidal. Life went on as it usually does, and my painful memories faded somewhat. Time, they say, is a wonderful medicine, but I can assure you that it is not a miracle cure. It takes work, and I worked at it, carving out a new life for myself. When the first Christmas came, I couldn't let it go by without doing something. I went and bought a gift for Beth and sent it off, not knowing how to sign it or say who it was from, not wanting to renew old heartache. I was quite surprised when I received a letter from Leeds the week after Christmas. Yes, Beth had written me a little letter thanking me and telling me something about her life. Obviously, some adult had helped her, and I was pretty sure it was Tom, not my ex-wife. I wondered if she even knew the letter had been sent, but I didn't let myself dwell on that possibility. In the letter, she referred to me as Papa James. I know this meant that I had been demoted and that Daddy was undoubtedly now Tom, but it actually cheered me up a lot. I was sure that Beth had 2 parents who loved her, and that I had a name by which she would probably always remember me. Daddy James. I continued to send her gifts for every birthday and Christmas, continued to receive thank you letters from her and pictures, proudly noting how her handwriting had improved over the next couple years or so. Often Tom would send a little note to tell me how well she was doing in school or dance class or something, but never once did he mention that I should visit her again. I guess I had secret hopes that we'd meet again soon, but a year or so later Beth mentioned her little brother in one of her letters, and I realized I'd better not drag this out. Tom and Maddie had 2 children, and I didn't become part of that family. Next chapter. Not surprisingly, my buddy Tim's wife had a friend. Well, sure, she had lots of friends, but you know what I mean. Her name was Sally. She was a lawyer, a couple years younger than me, dark-haired and slender, with the most fantastic pair of legs I'd ever seen. The fact that I'm mentioning her here at all, obviously, meant that Sally had become something special. Our interests aligned to such an extent that it seemed as if we'd always been meant for each other. Eventually I popped the question, We were both divorced, had good jobs, and just loved each other. Oh, James, she answered me with a wide smile on her face. I'd love to. But there was one but, an unspoken but undeniable but. What is it, Sally? I asked, wondering what that but might be. I know your story, James, she replied quietly. You're going to want to have children, aren't you? Of course, Sally, I grinned back. At least 2 and maybe more. But I can't have children, James. She shook me. That's why my last marriage broke up. My ex desperately wanted a son to continue his family line. You never told me that, I whispered, remembering that her ex-husband David was some petty baronet or something, which was why a son would be so important. Whose fault is that? Mine, James. We were tested and David was fine, but my eggs turned out not to be quite what they should be. Not impossible, but not very likely. And he ended your marriage just because of that, I asked, surprised. David always seemed like such a nice, reasonable guy whenever I met him. No, it wasn't just that. Sally answered me a little sadly. But it was that little problem that led to arguments. And eventually to our divorce. I'm so sorry, Sally. I didn't have the slightest idea. Couldn't you have adopted a child or something? I would have adopted, but David's family was totally against it and it ended up driving a wedge between us. Sad, I commented. Very sad, she agreed. But then I wouldn't have met you, would I? So you'll marry me, I pounced on her. The conversation continued, with Sally worrying that she didn't want another marriage to fail for the same reason, and me trying to assure her that I would accept it. We talked about possible adoption or other artificial means, which Sally, with her background, knew much more about than I did. Truth be told, we did have a lot to think about, and neither of us were getting any younger. Why don't you ask me again in 3 months, suggested Sally at last. When you've had time to think about it? How about I leave the question on the table and you give me the answer in 3 months, I objected. Earlier if you want. That's how we parted. I wanted her to say yes, but deep down I had to admit I had my doubts. I really wanted a child of my own. More than one, to be honest. An adoption and everything else left me feeling insecure. Unfortunately, so insecure that tiny cracks started to appear in our relationship that hadn't been there before and just weren't meant to be. There was no doubt that we would break up and we were still very happy together, but the doubts were there, and the question of marriage quietly receded into the background. They say every cloud has a silver lining. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I certainly wasn't thinking about clouds that morning as I sat in my office pondering how the hell to justify a major expenditure on a new project I was heading up. The last thing I wanted was for a phone call to interrupt my train of thought, especially one that had nothing to do with my project. Mr. Dawson asked in unfamiliar and rather officious voice. Mr. James Dawson? That's me, I replied casually, still focused on how to make $250,000 seem like pocket money. I need to ask you a couple of security questions, Mr. Dawson. Okay, I replied, still a little unhappy at being interrupted. But first of all, who are you? I'm sorry, retorted the voice, sounding not at all apologetic. My name is Mrs. Murphy from Hedling Social Services. Hedling is a suburb of Leeds. I know exactly where Heading is, Mrs. Murphy, I replied, and my interest suddenly increased tenfold. How can I help you? Are you Mr. James Edward Dawson? That I am. And you were formerly married to Mrs. Madeline Dawson, who afterwards became Mrs. Wellings. That's me, I repeated, a little annoyed at her officialism. For security purposes, could you give me your ex-wife's middle name? Jean, I replied. Satisfied with this, she also asked me for her date of birth, to which I of course answered correctly again. What does all this mean? I asked somewhat more insistently. Hedling Social Services has been instructed to settle some outstanding matters concerning the late Mrs. Wellings. The late Mrs. Dawson, I asked, realizing immediately that I was referring to Tom's mother. But she died some years ago, and I never met the woman. What could that possibly have to do with me? On the contrary, Mr. Dawson replied the voice. Mrs. Wellings died 6 days ago. She was killed in a motorcycle accident, along with her husband. What? She couldn't have. They... My voice trailed off, As the meaning of her words reached me, I almost dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, Mr. Dawson," the welfare woman continued. "I thought you should have known." "What about Beth?" I exclaimed aloud, as horrible thoughts raced through my brain. "She's all right, isn't she? Please tell me she's all right." "She's a little upset, sir," the woman continued, the slightest trace of humanity appearing in her face for the first time. "She wasn't involved in the accident, but she's obviously very upset. She's been asking about you, but it took us a few days to track you down." "Where is she?" I shouted into the phone. "I'm on my way out. I'll come and get her." The woman told me that they had her address, and 5 minutes later I was in my car and driving out of the parking lot, forgetting about such an important project. I was nervous as hell sitting in Mrs. Murphy's rather messy office, convincing her that I really was who I was, and that there was no doubt that I wanted Beth. To my surprise, I discovered that Tom and Maddie had done nothing to change the situation. And of course I hadn't heard anything about the adoption request. Legally speaking, I was still Beth's father, since that's what it said on her birth certificate. Wow. I guess I was upset at the news of Maddie and Tom's deaths, even considering what she'd done to me. But I was so excited to see Beth again that such thoughts and feelings just didn't have time to penetrate my soul. But there was something else I hadn't thought of. Finally, there was a knock on the door, and another woman entered the room, holding Beth's hand. My Beth. The first time I'd seen her in almost 4 years. "Daddy, is it really you?" asked Beth timidly. No wonder, because even though I had been sent pictures of her, she hadn't seen me since she was 4 years old. "Yes, it's me, honey." I squeezed out, and the first tear trickled down my cheek, and I held out my arms to her. "Daddy, Daddy!" she screamed, running up to me. "I've missed you. I knew you'd come for me. I told you there was something else I had completely forgotten about, and that omission suddenly became apparent as I hugged my daughter." When I tried to lift Beth into my arms, something was wrong. When I looked down, I was surprised to see another toddler clinging hard to Beth's skirt. Oh shit, I'd forgotten. Beth had a little brother. "This is Jimmy," Beth introduced me as I pulled her down to the ground again, not wanting to scare the poor little guy with a tug-of-war victory. Nevertheless, the poor little guy looked like he was about to burst into tears. He was about 3 years old or so, and he looked like a real baby. Dark-haired, strong-built, looked like a future rugby player. He was clearly scared to death, but he held himself manfully, not knowing what the future held for him. "Hi, Jimmy." I smiled encouragingly at him, but he still looked around just as uncertainly. "It's Papa James, Jimmy," Beth encouraged her little brother. "Say hi." "Papa James, who was your real daddy?" he asked Beth, keeping his eyes on me. "Yes, Jimmy," she told him. "Mommy and Daddy always told us how good he was, and now he's going to be our daddy and take us in with him." Mrs. Murphy opened her mouth to speak, no doubt wanting to correct that innocent statement since nothing had been discussed regarding Jimmy, but I raised my hand to stop her, and she had the good sense to remain silent. "My mommy and Daddy went to heaven," muttered little Jimmy. "Aren't you going to be our new daddy?" "How old are you, Jimmy?" I asked, looking at the little guy, and a thought suddenly occurred to me. "Free," he told me. "Free and... At this point, he turned to his big sister for help. "He's 3 and 4 months old," Beth finished for him. "His birthday is November 7th. "Gee," I exclaimed as the truth became clear. The math turned out not to be difficult at all. 3 years and 4 months plus another 9 months, and that put us back to mid-October. Yes, a month before Tom was released from prison about 4 years ago. Combined with Jimmy's build and complexion, I had no doubt. Jimmy was my son. For heaven's sake, they must have known that and even named him Jimmy after me. No wonder Maddie wasn't there the one and only time I visited, for by then she should have shown herself by now. "Come and give your daddy a hug, kiddo." I grinned, feeling warmth spill over me. He hesitated for a moment and jumped into my arms. Beth followed, and the 3 of us hugged and cried, oblivious to those around us. After that, it was business as usual. I had the legal right to pick up Beth, and it only took 10 minutes in front of a hastily found judge to get the right to pick up Jimmy as well. Of course, I'd have to do the paperwork later, but I knew a lady legal counselor who I hoped would be happy to help me with that. This is my friend Sally. I introduced my 2 new charges the next day, noticing that her eyes had already clouded over. Are you going to be our new mom? Asked little Jimmy. Hush, Jimmy, admonished Beth to her brother. Daddy said this woman is a friend of his. As Sally stared at them for a few moments before saying something, and I held my breath. It's okay, Beth. She finally managed to mumble as her tears rolled down. If your daddy still wants me, I think you two are the answer to our prayers, and I'd love to be your new mom. The offer was still on the table, and the 3 months hadn't expired yet, so you can guess how it ended. Can't you? Sally and I took them both for a walk that day, and we held hands, ran together, played together, laughed together, and watched together. Yes, that's right. We went to the damn zoo again. Of course, there were hard times in the months and years that followed, as my kids reminisced about Tom and Maddie being their parents. But time does heal, and those times passed as our children grew up, and Sally and I began to age happily together. Beth became a veterinarian, is happily married to a young civil engineer, and we are looking forward to having our first grandchildren. Jimmy has joined the Royal Air Force and has just received his wings. I wonder if his love of airplanes stems from the number of times we dragged each other to Old Warden to see the museum there. The end.